welcome. I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros, and this is Preparing Like a Pro. This time we are going to discuss a topic which is seldom discussed in general, and that is space as a weapon. Now, mostly this will feature Magnus games, and the very first one is Magnus Carlsen playing Lazaro Bruzon. So e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d3. Now, d3 is not the most topical move. Most of the time, d4 is being played at the highest level. In fact, famously, this was a matchup between Magnus Carlsen and Ivanchuk. But this time, Magnus opts for d3, which seems to be a bit more restricted. However, you may notice that white tries to keep the structure intact. So what you'll see is that Magnus is going to go for long-term ideas, trying to gain space and use that space for his advantage. So knight c6, g3, d5. And of course, we ended up in a classical King's Indian attack. It is, of course, the American champion's favorite, obviously Bobby Fischer. Now, Bobby Fischer usually played it with knight to d2, knight b d2, and then continued on with his development, famous for the Fischer-Unzicker game, which we're not going to delve into, but I'm pretty sure you may have seen that one before. However, in this case, Magnus plays queen e2, a favorite of Zwagintsev, and a move that actually has a different idea. Queen e2 is saying my bishop, Magnus's bishop, is going to be very useful when it's opened up, and the knight isn't just going to block its view. So queen e2 is sort of an attempted improvement, or at least an alternative, of playing this variation without committing the knight early. Knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, and b5. Now, in the other game, black is going to castle, and then white actually attempts that e5 push. In this game, black decides to go b5, and our big question will be, how should we respond as white? So these are all the important things in chess. Whenever your opponent does something unusual, strays from the normal patterns, that actually gives you a free chance, a free shot at doing something original yourself. So the big question is whether we should continue the same way or should we mix it up. Note that the decision of going b5 still left black's king in the center. So it is in some respect different from the lines with castling. Hello, good evening everyone. From Colombia, hello Brian, hello Patrick, and many others. So what would be the first thing that I would note is this bishop on g2 actually potentially having some targets all along the diagonal. So you'll have to find a way to exploit it. So the space lecture, so we're going to go out in a limb and say e5. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Anyone with a different idea? From St. Louis, welcome, Mike. And hello, b9 form. So oftentimes, it is worth noting what your opponent is doing. In this case, this is weakening the long diagonal. c4 is an interesting idea. However, it would run into captures, and the e-pawn is hanging. Probably knight takes. But the direction is right. You are trying to open it up. And that's what Magnus did. He actually went for e takes d5. Exactly. Thank you, Alex. E takes d5. And I know we're talking about space, but it does not necessarily mean that you have to be dogmatic. In fact, space can be gained in different ways. It doesn't really have to be e5, although that's the trusted Fischer method. So e takes d5, and d4. So even though this is not like the traditional way of gaining space, or the way you'd think about it, but white is sort of lacking space. This pawn is not really taking control of the center. So even though white is wasting a move, d4 gains that little bit of space. Why does this work? Well, now white actually targets the b5 pawn, hits the c5 pawn concurrently, and it means that because black actually didn't castle early on, white can take advantage of those weakened pawns on the queen side. c4 is played, and the next move is actually very, very, very nice and tactical at the same time. Of course, c4 was more or less forced, because otherwise one of the pawns would have fallen. And this next move by Magnus is fairly creative, but also extremely logical, noting the fact that the black king is still in the middle. So technically, if white could gain a momentum, or gain the right type of momentum, he could get the initiative. a4, probably I will push my pawn in that case. It's even more energetic than a4, but you are looking in the right direction. Knight e5. It is a pawn sacrifice. Now if you go bishop g5, I'm just in time to castle, and you can't really punish black. The interesting part of knight e5 is that white is willingly giving up a pawn, saying, well, if you take my pawn, which Bruzon did, I will have an easier time targeting that pawn on d5. Also, it gains more space and gets the knight on a beautiful outpost. So knight takes d4, queen d1, eyeing both the d5 pawn and the knight on d4. Queen b6, bishop e3, pinning it to win it. Bishop c5, and let's try find the next move for white. It's fairly logical, but hey, a good move is a good move. There's no such thing. We may label them in any other way, but a good move will always be a good move. Yep. B4, in case of b4, c takes b3. Oh yeah, just a little bit of a disclaimer. Maybe is auto-corrected, so it's going to be deleted immediately. Why? Because it doesn't quite exist. Not in this lesson or in this lecture. Synonyms don't work either. But good try, good try. Knight c3, indeed. Knight c3 is the move. Of course, you want to develop and set up a threat. That is actually 101 initiative. You want to develop your pieces and you want to set up a threat immediately. So that's why actually Magnus's idea of knight e5 is so strong, because he's immediately setting up threats that Bruzon will have to deal with. If you go bishop takes d4, the issue is black captures back and you're actually losing an important part of your attack, the dark squared bishop. So knight c3, bishop e6. However, even though you played this energetic move, knight c3, get the knight to e5, go bishop e3, you still got to keep on rolling. Black is not so far away from safety. Well, if black decides to go here, I take here, and I got immense pressure on your pieces. I mean, of course, the rook is hanging as well. So, in fact, in that scenario, Bruzon would be under pressure and be down up. Well, he's not down upon in that case, but he definitely would be worse in a position where he doesn't even have the extra pawn. So what looks kind of tricky in this position is that it seems so safe for black. However, there is something loose in black's camp. Knight d5, you capture back. If you take on d4, your knight is still hanging, so knight takes b5 doesn't quite work. But as I said earlier, you don't want to part with your dark squared bishop unless success is within reach. Just look at the direction where Carlsen is playing. Usually, you want to play on the side where you're strongest. Most of your moves has been aiming on this side of the board, the queen side. So it would be just logical if you follow up in the same way. And knight d5, that'd be just a bit too much. a4. Oh, that's not the move, but a4. Oh, a4, undermining the b5 pawn. So if you just castle, I can take this, and the biggest issue that black is facing is that this construction with the queen, bishop, knight is not as stable as it looks. Anytime this knight will move, I will have this dastardly move of knight a4, and even if you go here, I can take and take your rook. So a4 might not seem that strong, but it does pinpoint how fragile this formation is for black. So black goes b4, a5, queen c7. And now white does play quite pretty move. It's not too hard, but you know, it's still a looker. But indeed, you could try to go like queen d2, rook d1. White always had compensation, but Carlsen is trying to play on the loose pieces that Bruzon has. Yeah, a5 was there, well, to make sure the queen will have to move, and also it has one other hidden agenda behind it, and that is to get the a4 square exactly. Knight a4. Hello, hello. So knight a4, point being, if you take on e5, I take on c5, and things look sketchy. Like if you go here, I take here. This is still loose, and now my bishops will start hunting down the queen, and put on immense pressure in the center of the board. So even if you lose a pawn, the pressure will be just too much to handle. So knight a4, bishop d6, knight takes c4, and here takes on c4, bishop takes d4. But the funny thing is, you might be wondering if knight f3 could work, but white can take here, so as you can never capture with the pawn, the rook would be hanging. Queen takes c4, and now white has this beautiful little move of knight c5. The queen is near trapped over here, and white also has this bishop e2 move, and once I pick up this bishop on c5, it doesn't really matter that like pawn counts don't even matter anymore, because you can't castle, your king is stuck in the middle, and my bishops are just going to slice up your position completely. So therefore, black makes the educated choice of taking on c4 with the queen, bishop takes d4, bishop e7, b3, queen c7. Okay, so credit where credit is due. Black is actually defending quite well. White does have the initiative, but having the initiative often isn't enough. You have to create something more tangible. The initiative is something that at the end of the day, you will have to transform to something bigger and better. And don't forget, black is still a single move away from safety. Most of what Carlsen did so far is extremely logical. Just decided that black's king is vulnerable in the center, so he may as well go after it. So he actually went for c4, which is a great move. You're trying to hit the iron while it's still hot. Rook e1 would give ample time for black to get the king into safety. Rook d8. And now he's going in. Bishop takes, c takes d5. Hello. You like white's play? Good for you. So c takes d5. The funny thing, though, that bishop takes, c takes d5, white actually succeeded. The hardest part that actually black had a chance to take the advantage. Can you spot this move for Bruzon? No, it was played between Carlsen and Bruzon. I am just here explaining what happened and how it happened. D takes, indeed. Bishop d4. And here is the most remarkable move that Bruzon had to find, and it's not at all easy. Castles. And the funny thing is, you're pinned. Black is in no rush, but slowly but surely he's going to go bishop f6 and pick up the piece. And black is doing all right. So what's actually fascinating in any type of game you look, sometimes you get a golden chance to turn everything around. Oh, you miss it, it'll be gone. So after bishop takes, d takes c4 was one chance for black to turn it around, or at least keep balance. But decided to take, which is logical though. C takes, rook c1, queen takes a5, knight c5, getting the knight in. bishop c8, d6, bishop c3. Now, you may notice that this is not your typical space advantage, but this d-pawn actually is acting as something of a black piece repellent. All them pieces are forced back there, and they barely can move. So centralizes, over defends the knight, bishop g4, h3, bishop e2. And this next move is very powerful by Carlsen. And it again plays on the idea of gaining even more space. Now black seems to be doing all right because he's got the bishops, and that's a form of compensation for what's happening. And white does have some amazing pieces in the center. Now Magnus's next move is pain to behold, d7. So in this case, you can see just because of the d-pawn, black's rooks are completely running out of any moves to make. And d7 is quite strong because it gives up the rook, but this rook on f1 wasn't really that useful in the first place. It was sort of a hindrance anyways. It wouldn't really contribute that much. Bishop takes back, g6, rook d1. So oftentimes, all these super grandmasters, they're willing to part with an exchange if they feel that they can maximize the potential of those pieces. However, even though white is better in this position, there is one more thing that Magnus will have to look out for. What is that lurking danger that white will need to consider while he's trying to win this chess game? Because there is a form of problem we may face, even though knight b7 may seem tempting. What could be a potential problem with knight b7 and trying to win the material back? How would that drop the advantage? Or why would it drop the advantage? You don't want to trade queens. Exactly. If white starts trading pieces, at the end of the day, opposite colored bishop ending, so it's a draw. So white is banking on the fact that he's got extra space due to the d7 pawn, also that the queens are still on the board, which in fact will help him with the attack. So rook b8, bishop f1. That is the reason knight b7 is avoided by Magnus, because it would lead to mass trades and potentially a draw. Bishop f1, the bishop is moving to c4. Bishop c4, oh, bishop f6. Okay, so one step is done. It's all good. However, we are not done yet. This next set of plan is pretty nice. It's not too hard to find, but it will be quite essential for white to succeed. h4, well, black may just go h5. Now, I'm not saying h4 is any bad. However, you may want to find a plan that's a bit more aggressive than that. Queen f3, these are one-move threats. Yes, of course, you can try to attack the bishop. That's a good idea. However, your queen is doing quite well in the center. Does the white queen belong on the dark squares? I don't think so. Honestly, I don't think so. So you often have to wonder what will be the long-term target for white. And that will help you and will guide you towards the right move, or towards the move that might be the strongest. The f7 pawn, exactly. The f7 pawn is a big, big target in this position. But right now it's well guarded by the rook on f8. Well, you can go rook e1, but the point is to go rook e3. The point is to go after the f7 pawn. Sorry about those. The mouse is just getting a little bit hyperactive. Rook e3, and the point is you are going to go after the f7 pawn. And once the f pawn is gone, the king on h8 is going to be ultra weak. 5, rook f3, and this is sort of an empty move. White already controls all the white squares and light squares, so practically it doesn't really set up any threats. Bishop g7, h4, knight d4. Now the knight is coming over. d4, knight g5, takes, bishop back. But the difference is, once white captures on f7, that's just way too much to handle, especially as rook h7 checkmate is on the cards. And here black resigned. Of course, if you take, knight takes, and I promote. So this was sort of the case where you use the d pawn to gain the extra space, and that was the way to actually consolidate the advantage and then turn it into a decisive one. So the next game is going to be a bit more classical in the style of gaining space. And that game is between Magnus Carlsen and Ding Liren. It's the same opening. Queen e2, knight f6, bishop g2, castles, castles, and you'll be surprised to hear what white played in this position. Probably you won't be. Remember, it is obviously about space as a weapon, so of course it's pawn to e5. Knight d7, and well, I've been talking a lot about Nimzowitsch. My previous lectures were all about Nimzowitsch, and here you'll actually get to use that pawn. If you overprotect it, you may actually get successful. However, in this case, now white will get extra options as he did not commit his knight to d2 yet. So many other cases, whenever you play e5, white can't do some particular maneuvers that Carlsen will actually accomplish this game. So if you think about this position, what do you think will be black's main idea? And that should be a giveaway of what Carlsen should do, or what he actually did. Ding's supposed to be chilling? Not anymore. No chill from Ding. Well, usually white is the one playing on the king side and not black. Not saying that f6 is necessarily a bad move. Although it does create a potential target on e6. Yeah, b5. Black usually wants to play on the queen side, while white is trying to play on the other side of the board. Now, as white played queen e2 instead of knight to d2, white gets an extra option, which can sort of dissuade black from going with this b5 plan. Also notice that if we consider the flank and who has more space in the flank, it's clearly black. Black has 2 pawns and we don't have any. So how can we compensate for that? It's a fairly strong move by Magnus. c4, very good. The whole point being, white is trying to stop that b5 expansion. Also, if they would trade, which would be a terrible mistake, well, at least an inaccuracy, in that case, it would be even on the sides, and in the middle of the board, white would have an extra pawn. So just purely on looking at the middle of the board, you could tell white is better. Here, of course, it's still a dynamic game because each side has 1 pawn in the center. However, white should be just a little bit considered better due to the fact that he's got a pawn in black's position. d4, fairly committal, deciding to do the same thing to white, getting 1 pawn inside white's belly. Okay, so any of you remember the Fischer-Unzicker game? Anyone remembering the King's Indian Classic games? Chat, anyone? Because this is not that exact typical Fischer game, however, the patterns are roughly the same. So if you are familiar, and that is why you should study the classics, they do come on in handy. Here, white plays the classical move. Rook e1, overprotecting the pawn on e5. Rook b8, h4, b5. And now you'll see the difference between the knight d2 lines. In this case, white captures on b5, rook takes b5, and knight to a3. When the knight was already committed to d2, knight a3 wouldn't be a possibility. You wouldn't be able to win time on the rook. Rook b8. Okay, so remember, chess is a game for 2. Or more if it's a team game. But in this case, you'll still have to wonder what your opponent is planning to accomplish. It's clear that they're going to play on the queen side. However, you may want to just guess what sort of break Ding will be looking for. Yeah, black is going to go for the plan of bishop a6 and pawn c4 break. Exactly. That's the main idea. So black already committed on playing on the queen side, so in this case is not going for the f6 break. So how can white try to stop this plan? How can white stop black from accomplishing this c4 break? b3, knight c4, or rather knight c4 immediately, because that eliminates any tricks. There is a little bit of a difference between move orders, because if you go b3, black may even consider giving up a pawn just so he could open up some files. If you go knight c4, it is highly unlikely you can go for any tricks. Knight b6 and now b3 takes. We take with the b pawn. So for now, white is also pretty happy, as black as well, because he got the open file. But on the other hand, this rook ain't really attacking anything, and there aren't really any entry squares for the rook, for the moment at least. Rook b6. So rook b6, and now your knowledge of King's Indian attack will come in handy, because what you're going to see is textbook Fischer type of attack. And I hope you'll channel your inner Fischer right now. Knight g5, of course. The main idea, but the point isn't bishop e4 necessarily, but to get your queen to h5 and put immediate pressure on the h7 square. The leap, indeed. h6 and knight h3. This is actually the main point. White is provoking this hook, and now there is something that Carlsen can go after. Bishop b7, queen g4, luring the king. And now you can tell that black's concept went completely wrong, because if he'd go king h7, white could just give a check. And even if g6, I could just do the cheeky queen h5 move. Of course, can't touch this. And queen takes h6 is just winning on the spot. That's not something that you can deal with. Therefore, black goes king h8, queen h5, and it feels like it's almost game over. However, to credit Ding Liren, he's a very, very resourceful player. It already is pretty bad, so it's not going to change the result of the game. White is probably going to be pressing in. Eventually win, as you'll see. However, this next move just shows how resourceful the Chinese player can be. There's black to move and find a carefully crafted, interesting resource. Now, if black is just waiting idly, bishop takes h6 is going to happen and checkmate. You can't quite stop that idea. However, the queen on h5 is actually a little bit undefended and is a potential target. So black can have a tactical idea that could exploit it. And it's quite a nice defensive move, as I said earlier. Queen e8, very good. But what if I just take the pawn? Well spotted. It is queen e8, and it's a typical defensive move. But what's the point? F5, very good. F5, and of course you can take en passant, which would be pain all around the board because I have pressure on your e-pawn. You can't just defend the queen because I'm going to win your bishop. So technically white is forced to trade queens in this case, otherwise it's just a free bishop for no or little compensation. Unfortunately for Ding, already Magnus got enough of an advantage, which he will capitalize on, but it still shows that there are some defensive resources here for black, and if he would have played it a little bit better, then black would be doing okay. The bishop sacrifice looks nice, but it doesn't quite work. So takes, bishop d2, king g7, knight f4, bishop f3. Even h5 is an idea, but Magnus is in no rush. Rook b1. Obviously, once you get the advantage on the position, you want to trade. Takes, bishop a8, h5. Trying to provoke some trades. Of course, this wouldn't work though. g5, knight g6, bishop d8, rook b5, going after the pawn. Also notice that he made sure his only weakness is well guarded. Here, g4, bishop b6, a4. And it may feel a little premature, but he did resign in this position, mostly because a5 is coming, and after the c5 pawn falls, that'd be just way too many pawns, and black's pieces are really, really passive. Black literally can't move. That is correct, Patrick Daly. Okay, so I showed a couple of Magnus games, but I want to show a bit about what's in the future. Well, there is one Nodirbek Abdusattorov, very, very strong Uzbek player, and don't be surprised if you're going to see him challenging for the world title in the near future. So apart from showing a couple of these Magnus games, I do want to show you a recent game by Nodirbek versus the reigning women's world champion, Wenjun Ju. So this will be a different opening, but it'll be still about space. So e4, e5, knight c6. All the other games featured the King's Indian attack. This one is e4, e5, d3, and bishop b3. Very topical of recent. People like playing with knight f6 and bishop e7, even though bishop c5 was more popular in the past. And here Wenjun Ju plays the very aggressive move, and she's trying to actually question Nodirbek's bishop on b3. But remember, we're actually discussing the topic of space. The big question, how can Nodirbek respond to this aggressive move while also gaining control of the center? c4. Now c4, if you are actually pulling faces while you're listening to me, I agree with you. It feels wrong. Everyone teaches you that the bishop shouldn't be completely blocked in by your own pawn. However, this bishop might have a new lease of life when it goes to a4 and put pressure on the c6 knight. Also, white is completely restricting black's play and stopping her from ever getting that d5 break. So it is a very ugly looking move, but it has an idea behind it. So d6, bishop e3, controlling that square on d4. Also, there is this sneaking technique and sneaky idea that often happens whenever white creates this C4, D3, E4 structure. Eventually, white will hope to get D4 in. Not in this game, but even if you see some English openings, that knight c3, d4 becomes an idea, and after the trades, white does get the Maroczy type of structure where black is sort of lacking counterplay because d5 moves are restricted. So bishop e3, knight d7, bishop a4. Just as I told you, white is trying to put pressure on those knights. Knight b4, very creative. However, it does lose a lot of time. So what you might notice is that Wenjun is making a lot of knight moves, and that doesn't really help her to actually get this bishop out. So knight b4, a3, knight a6, knight c3. And as black is sort of passive in this position, there comes an idea. He is trying to gain space, like either with d4 or an eventual b4. How do you think Wenjun could have tried to balance that out? And this move might look ugly at first, but it would definitely make sense nonetheless. So we're looking for a move for black that looks ugly, however is kind of useful. c5. And I mean, it is just as ugly as c4 was when the bishop was still on b3. However, it discounts and stops d4 forever. And the only thing that white can hope for is a b4 break, but even that is going to take a while. While she could go for an f5 break later on. So c5 could have been something to consider in this position. However, I do understand why she didn't do it. It doesn't look that appealing. It looks kind of ugly because it makes her position look like a Swiss cheese with all those holes on d5, b5, and f5. So she went for c6, which actually is more of a harmonic move. Bishop c2, knight c5, b4, knight e6, queen d2. A lot of these positions are hard to play. So even though some of the moves might not appeal to you, it's always difficult to maneuver whenever nothing is clarified yet. Because white always has this d4 idea, and black always has to keep that in mind. You never really know when he's going to go for that, and based on that, black has to be able to respond accordingly. Knight f6, and all these moves still make a lot of sense. It's not that she has a terrible position, although Nodirbek is slightly better. Knight a4, now taking advantage of that move. And that's actually what makes close positions so exciting or interesting, is that anytime your opponent makes a move, it may have a positive side to it, but a drawback too. The drawback of her move knight to f6 is now Nodirbek has access to the b6 square. AB, AB, b5. CB, CB. And the question is, how should we follow up? And as far as you could see, the position has been quite slow, but it's going to pick up pace soon enough. One of the things that I think sets Nodirbek apart from the other players is his ambitions. Ambitious play actually leads to good results. Dropping back your knight ain't that ambitious. Bishop b6 is a bit more ambitious, but Nodirbek was even more ambitious than that. Went knight to b6. Now, it's not at all that risky, because the knight will have a way back to d5. But also notice, this immediately pressures Wenjun to give up an open file. So apart from having more space now, Nodirbek has an open file to work with. Bishop b7, bishop b3, and pressing all along this diagonal. d5, rook a7, very energetic play, putting pressure. D takes e4, knight takes e5, queen c7. And it is time for us to channel our Uzbek energy in this position. So Wenjun is, by the way, fighting really well, and the position is objectively, well, I wouldn't say even, but definitely tenable. Boom, knight takes f7. In comes the knight. And of course, you gotta take that horsey. You can't do this, bishop takes e6, and you lose immediately. So this is an invitation you cannot refuse. Now, in this case, White played the extremely logical queen a2, but queen a2 is not the best. The shocking d takes e4 is the best move here, and apparently White is just slowly going to go knight d5, queen e2, and Black is defenseless against all those numerous threats. But who would go d takes e4 in a practical game? Not many. So I don't really blame Nodirbek for going queen a2. Now, interestingly enough, queen a2 was inaccurate, and Wenjun could have saved herself here, or at least get a position which is defendable. So let's help her. Let's see if we can find this defensive idea. And it's more of a cold-blooded way of playing. King e8 doesn't really help much. And also doesn't look good, to be honest. Knight g4, well, that would be just jackpot for White. It's not easy. It's not easy. In fact, Black should have played the very, very cold-blooded move of rook d8. So king e8, well, of course, the issue is the king is just cutting off your rook. Believe it or not, anytime you're thinking of a bad move, that doesn't mean that can actually help you, guide you towards the right answer. The fact that y'all all wanted to go king e8, well, you could do it without actually misplacing your rook on f8. And after takes king f8, Black actually is not far off from doing okay. But of course, rook d8, king f8, in that case, you have to be very confident that all is going to work out for you. But, you know, in chess, sometimes it'll boil down to nerves. So queen a2, come back to me. Queen c6, rook takes b7. Queen takes, bishop takes, king e8, d takes e4. And unfortunately for Wenjun, she was forced to do what you all considered the best. So it's a shame. If you guys would have suggested rook d8, maybe she would have found it. It's all you guys' fault. But seriously, Black actually is struggling now because the king is misplaced, and also these bishops are sniping all around the board. And also note that knight is actually still so strong on b6. Queen takes e4, knight d5. And I think that Wenjun Ju was more looking at if she's losing immediately. But in fact, even though she's not losing immediately, her pieces are so badly misplaced, there's no question that her position is bad. So bishop d8, h3, even at the highest level, you got to create a loop for the king. Rook f7, not even considering capturing that rook. Knight takes, check. Queen d6, check. Of course, if you go here, you get back ranked. King e8, bishop takes d5, queen e7. Let's find the last move that Nodirbek played, and after that, Wenjun Ju resigned. One more move, and everything collapses. Queen c6, of course, and it was a game over, because if you go queen d7, there's bishop takes f7. I take the rook, take the game. If you go here, bishop c5, and those infamous bishops just snipe away, and it is game over. So I really hope you could notice that with the idea of gaining space, you get more opportunities to gain an advantage. So I hope you could learn a thing or two how you could use that to your benefit. So thank you so much for watching, and hope you'll come again. Thank you.